So President Joe Biden is set to sign the Inflation Reduction Act into law. It was a shocking turn of events, secret surprise deal worked out between Schumer and Manchin that they managed to keep the entire Democratic caucus on board with. And joining us to talk about what this means, what's in it, all of the details is the perfect guest who has been following the ins and outs of this all the way along, even when it looked like there was no hope that anything would actually come of it. Jeff Stein, economics reporter for The Washington Post. Great to see you, Jeff.
Good to see you, man.
Thanks for reminding me how painful this whole thing has been. I appreciate it.
Yeah, but it's done now. You're good.
Yes,
right.
Just about done and dusted. Let's go ahead and put your latest reporting up on the screen, which I thought was a very interesting look at this legislation and what it hopes to accomplish. Your headline here is West Virginia coal country will test power of Democrats' climate bill. You interview a man who has been a coal miner and, of course, has seen ups and downs as that industry has declined and is now hoping to get a green energy job in West Virginia as part of this deal. Why don't you use that as an entree to talk about the approach to climate that this particular deal and particular legislation hopes to enact?
Yeah, so just to zoom out for a second here and give sort of the broader historical context, when climate change first emerged as a clear national, international crisis, the initial response from policymakers was to put a price on carbon. So you got carbon tax proposals, cap and trade proposals, kinds of things that would directly disincentivize and raise the cost of using and consuming carbon. And for reasons that I don't have to tell you guys about, that was a political disaster. People don't want to have to spend more. Saagar, I really enjoyed your clip the other day about blaming people for higher gas prices and sort of the stupidity of that. People are often struggling, and higher gas prices is a very difficult way politically to force through a change to deal with climate change. And so in the last really just 10, 15 years, we've had a complete 180, complete revolution in the approach that, particularly in the Democratic Party, I think, in large part or in part because of the Green New Deal and AOC and the left sort of pushing a different approach. And that approach has said, instead of sacrificing economic growth, what if we, instead of targeting sort of the supply side of raising carbon, we instead dramatically reduce the cost of renewables, solar, and we tied that to a new attempt to revive the American industrial core, the Appalachian core, that has been so hollowed out by the decline of the old energy economy. And so, and thanks for identifying that, Krystal. I really appreciate it. I think the attempt of that story was to say, there's all this talk about the bill, but sort of what's the core thing that this bill is trying to do? And I think it's become so obvious to so many people that people aren't really talking about the main intention of the bill. And that's really this profound attempt at reviving America's manufacturing base with clean energy jobs. And we can get into the odds that has of success, but I think that's the core philosophy here. And I talked to a lot of coal miners and others in West Virginia who are optimistic. Right now, West Virginia used to be this industrial powerhouse, manufacturing powerhouse, and it's obviously now one of the poorest states in the country. And so that has been a really devastating transition. And there's this hope that maybe this will bring in these new high-paying jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the piece and just generally about the attempt at bringing down costs, which, I'm a major proponent of, is that this is both a departure in a different direction, but also shows you very much like what Joe Manchin's philosophy is around all of this. So can you point to the specific program that you talk about here about, moving from a coal job to working in a battery facility? How plausible is that on a mass scale for people who are involved in those declining industries?
It's a great question. So I think the first thing you mentioned about Manchin's philosophy, right? If you were just designing a climate bill, there's tons of stuff in here that you would have no reason of including, expediting fossil fuel projects, money for mining. There is stuff in here that only makes sense from an energy abundance, American energy independence, and lower energy cost for consumer perspective. Which is not what a lot of the Democratic Party wanted to do, but was forced through by Manchin and his sort of demands. On the question of can this really work? I talked to a lot of mainstream centrist economists. Some might accuse them of being more on the more neoliberal side of things, who say that this is a climate bill, a deficit reduction bill, and a healthcare bill. It is not an economic manufacturing bill. Even the most optimistic readings, there's about 12, 13 million manufacturing jobs in America right now. This would add roughly $100,000 a year, over 100,000 new jobs, manufacturing jobs a year over the next 10 years. So, that's something, but it's pretty small relative to the overall number. One of the big problems is solar and wind production. You need the construction jobs to build the thing, but unlike coal, which requires tons of manpower to sustain, they kind of run on their own accord. And so the per job output per energy produced is relatively minimal. The estimates for West Virginia, I talked to the owners of this battery production plant. Lots of people are looking at West Virginia because it has a really trained workforce. It has lots of natural resources, abundant water, and sort of the logistical trucking and supply routes that have fallen dormant, but that could actually be used as an export base. So there's some hope for West Virginia in that reason. But the biggest facility that could open with renewable jobs is this battery plant that you mentioned. They're building sort of long duration battery storage that could go into decarbonizing agriculture and other heavy industries. That's there's lots of money in that, both in the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, to sort of encourage those kinds of jobs. At most, we're thinking that could be 3,000 jobs, maybe a little more. But that's the equivalent of, I think we say in the piece that every 6 coal mines that have closed is the equivalent of 15,000 jobs. And over the last 20, 30 years, West Virginia has lost, I think, something on the order of 60, 70,000 coal mining jobs. So they have a long, long way to climb from where they were. And, obviously, I think, I don't want to sound too redundant or too obvious to people, but you drive around West Virginia and the remnants and the vestiges of a formerly great industrial power just everywhere. You can see the poverty, you can see what once was. And, just the statistic that blew my mind the most from the story was that in the 1970s, the biggest employer in West Virginia was West Virginia Steel. They paid an average of $16 an hour. And now the biggest employer in West Virginia is Walmart, which pays an average of about $15 an hour. And that is not adjusting for inflation. So over 40, 50 years, the main employer in West Virginia now pays less than they did in the 1970s. And so that decline is evident everywhere. And so I think some people are saying, look, this isn't going to revive the core of America's manufacturing hub, but it might be a start.
Yeah, West Virginia near and dear to my heart because it's where my dad and his side of the family are all from. So I spent a good deal of time in the state. I'm seeing exactly what you're talking about. There's a misconception that people there are just like, they just love coal and they're just all about coal. And it's like, no, this is just the one industry that's provided stable middle-class jobs and has supported, entire communities around this industry. So of course, they're not going to just willingly give that up without something to come in and make sure that they're going to be able to provide for their family on a basic level.
Absolutely. And a lot of the coal miners I spoke to who are now working in renewables are trying to make that point that, in particular, a lot of the solar industry, when they first started coming into West Virginia and Appalachia, they were paying, pretty low wages. And a lot of people on the left don't like to talk about this, but there are a lot of non-union firms. And the UMWA provided union, membership to coal miners for decades. And so, after the story came out, I got a lot of responses from sort of like smug people on the coast being like, these people will never learn, and kind of discussing about how about their intelligence, and besides the fact that most of these people would be completely lost doing the kind of manufacturing production jobs that coal miners know how to do, to your point, there's like a real rational economic reason that a lot of former coal miners have been reluctant to be part of this transition. But I think the hope is that with Manchin sort of bringing all this money specifically, I'll just mention one thing very quickly. The bill has specific tax credits for former, I think the technical term they use in the bill is like energy producing regions. And so there's money that's directly intended to flow to high coal producing areas that go above and beyond all the other credits in the bill. So that's kind of a hope to say, like, let's directly target West Virginia. So we'll obviously have to see if that works.
And then what do you make of some of the critique I've seen from the left that, you know, you're in the same bill that you're supposedly dealing with the climate, you're also giving a lot of goodies to the oil industry. And one of the most telling things is that actually big oil was kind of fine and cool with this bill. What do you make of that? And I know you're not, you know, specifically a climate reporter, but you've dug into these numbers. What does the analysis look like of what this will do on balance to emissions?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that there's things in here that are going to be bad for the climate. You know, the amount of new approvals for fossil fuel infrastructure is clearly putting us in the wrong direction in terms of reducing emissions. And so I don't want to pick a side, and I've seen those critiques too, and I understand where they're coming from. And I think in particular, I'm trying to work on a story about this, but a lot of the indigenous groups are particularly very upset because the approval process will be expedited in a way that has historically and traditionally been very devastating for indigenous communities. From a biological diversity perspective, there's a lot of things to be worried about from the expediting process that you're referring to. I do think that overwhelmingly, I haven't talked to a climate expert who doesn't think that this will in aggregate drive down a huge number of emissions. That on balance, this is a huge, huge win for carbon reduction and for the climate, even though those provisions are, as you said, you know, potentially driving up carbon costs. I think the one thing I would stress is that maybe 10, 15 years ago, the opposition to new fossil fuel infrastructure was at a much higher pitch among climate experts, in part because at the time, renewables were still so not cost competitive with fossil fuel infrastructure. And so like the Mountain Valley Pipeline that Manchin approved as part of this deal, you know, will carry all of this natural gas out from West Virginia to export to Europe. That's the hope in it. And 10 years ago, that would be a very, very scary prospect from a climate perspective because we didn't know if solar and wind would ever be able to catch up. But now one of the climate experts I talked to are not that worried about that because they think that even if it gets built now, natural gas has come up relative to renewables and cost so much that we think that will not be cost competitive in 10 years anyway. There's
basically
also,
what's happened to the coal industry is it's not, you know, not competitive.
Yes, exactly. So it's less of a reason to be afraid. The other thing that I would point out in terms of the oil industry being happy, and, you know, people can have, you know, totally legitimate different opinions about this, but there's a lot of money in here for carbon capture sequestration, the 45Q credits, money basically that's going to the oil and gas companies that they are supposed to use to lower their carbon footprint and sort of put money into other forms of renewable energy and to expedite other forms of renewable production. I talked to one, you know, traditionally natural gas and coal company that's now investing in wind because of this. And provisions like that, I think there's a lot of legitimate criticism that they are basically handouts to the fossil fuel companies, especially the oil companies that get this money for sort of unquestionably good carbon reduction schemes, putting carbon in the ground. Some climate people think that actually will, you know, is important and will lead to emission reduction, and other people think that it's just kind of a show. I think at the worst case that is kind of just like a necessary federal giveaway. But it's not the same as saying it will increase emissions. Does that make sense? Like, for the people who are saying this is a giveaway to the oil company, like, yes, but that's different from saying it's a giveaway to the oil company that will dramatically increase emissions.
Yeah, gotcha. So it's just a giveaway, but without planetary devastation accompanying it. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and you can be mad about like giving federal money and taxpayer money to the oil companies. Like, and I get being angry about that, but it's a different critique than saying, we're giving all this money to the oil companies to, you know, destroy the planet.
Got it.
All very well said. I recommend not just this particular piece of reporting from you to folks to really understand what's in this bill, but all of the work that you've been doing on this all the way along. And of course, always, guys, go and follow Jeff on Twitter so you can see what is coming next. Jeff, thank you so much for taking some time with us.
Thanks,
I know you're very busy.
Appreciate it, man.
Great to see you.
Thank you guys so much for watching. Really appreciate it. As we said, the results are in. People were truly at war with one another. So we decide to placate all sides. We will include, for premium members, the Vimeo link and the YouTube link. Vimeo if you want it ASAP, YouTube if you're possibly willing to wait a little bit. Everybody will be happy. You know, some people do forget this, but it is available as a podcast instantly. I know that many of you like to listen to that, but you know, watching it, and we don't spend all this money on production for a reason. So I get it. If you want to see, as you actually can see, for those who are just watching, we do take it very seriously, our responsibility to provide a very, very good premium experience. So if you would like to help us, the show, our mission, and more, there's a link down there in the description. Otherwise, we will see you all on Thursday.
Love y'all. See you Thursday. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.